Martha Place. On the morning of March 20th, 1899, prison officials in New York faced a problem no one had ever solved before. They were about to send electric current through a human being who happened to be a woman, and nothing in the short history of the electric chair told them how. So they improvised, clipping her hair to fit the head electrode and slitting her skirt to reach her ankle. And in doing so, they made Martha Place the first woman ever put to death this way anywhere on Earth. The question everyone wanted answered was simpler than the machinery. What had she done to end up in that room? Martha Place was born in rural New Jersey in 1849, and by middle age she had lived a life shaped by loss. She had worked as a dressmaker, married and been abandoned, and given up a young son for adoption when the money ran out. In 1893, she took a position as housekeeper for a Brooklyn widower named William Place, and married him later that year. The household came with one complication that would define everything that followed, and her name was Ida, William's teenage daughter. William had married Martha in part to help raise the girl. Instead of easing into the family, Martha grew consumed by jealousy. She became convinced her husband loved his daughter more than he loved her, and over 3 years that resentment hardened into open hostility until the two of them barely spoke. On at least one occasion, William called the police after Martha threatened the girl's life. For 3 long years, the tension simmered inside that house, and somehow it kept getting worse. Then, on February 7th, 1898, Martha attacked her stepdaughter inside the family home. By the time it was over, the young woman had been harmed fatally. When William returned that evening, Martha turned on him too, wounding him about the head before he tore himself loose and ran into the street for help. The officers who forced their way in found Martha in a gas-filled room in what looked like an attempt to end her own life, and found Ida dead upstairs. In the hours that followed, Martha Place was taken into custody at the scene, and the story spread through Brooklyn with a speed that matched its horror. Her husband, bleeding but alive, would become the prosecution's most important witness, laying out for a jury the years of jealousy, the earlier threats, and the night it all finally came due. She was indicted for murder in the first degree, and because the law of that era gave the trial judge no room to choose, everyone in the courtroom understood that a guilty verdict could carry only one sentence. So how does a jury in 1898 weigh the life of a woman accused of taking a child's? The answer came fast. An all-male jury deliberated less than 4 hours before convicting Martha Place, with her own husband's testimony at the center of the case. Her defense argued epilepsy and insanity, pointing to a sleigh accident in her 20s that her family said had left her mind permanently damaged. The jury didn't accept it. Judge William Hurd imposed the death sentence the law made mandatory, and her lawyers carried the fight upward, only for New York's highest court to review the conviction and let it stand. The electric chair itself was still a new and disputed machine, barely a decade in use, and no state had yet turned it on a woman. That single fact made Martha Place a test case that reached far beyond one house in Brooklyn. Reformers questioned whether it was right to execute a woman at all, while others insisted the law could not bend for her sex without bending for everyone. The newspapers of the day covered her with a cruelty that reads as grotesque now, dwelling on her face and her manner in the dehumanizing style of the era, while behind the scenes, the state wrestled with the sheer logistics of an execution the law allowed, but no one had ever performed. That left a single door still open, the governor's power to grant mercy, and it opened onto Theodore Roosevelt. Only days into his first term, Roosevelt refused to walk through it. He called the crime one of peculiar deliberation and atrocity, and reasoned that sparing her would amount to declaring that no woman should ever face capital punishment at all, a line he was unwilling to draw. He had said before that in the commission of a crime, he would deal with a woman exactly as he would a man, no differently. He kept his word, and after that, there was nothing left between Martha Place and the chair. On the morning itself, the death house held a crowd of witnesses drawn as much by history as by duty, men aware they were about to see something no one had ever seen. There was no precedent to steady them, no earlier woman's execution to measure this one against. Officials had rehearsed everything in advance: the placement of the electrodes, the timing of the current, even the words that would be spoken. All of it built from scratch for a single morning. And when it was over, the same men who had spent years arguing about whether the electric chair was a humane way to end a life found themselves holding a new answer and a fresh set of questions that would outlast the woman who had just supplied them. For better or worse, the state had proven it could do this. The only thing left undecided was whether it should have. Because no woman had ever been electrocuted, the state worked out the rest as it went, taking care even in the details of her clothing to preserve her modesty. Executioner Edwin Davis sent roughly 1,760 volts through her body, and witnesses said she was gone almost at once. She had chosen a plain black dress she had sewn herself, and she walked in composed, seated herself without a struggle, and left the assembled witnesses with almost nothing to describe. The physician who pronounced her dead was, by several accounts, also a woman. Another quiet first in a day full of them, and that physician called it the cleanest execution the facility had ever carried out. One newspaper noted that the last woman condemned in the state had gone to the gallows fighting and screaming, while Martha Place had barely made a sound. Martha Place was buried in the family plot in New Jersey. She had, in fact, been only the third woman sentenced to die in the electric chair, but the first two never reached it. One had been sent to an asylum, and the other had been sentenced only to win acquittal on a retrial the following year. That accident of timing is why, more than a century and a quarter later, her place in history hasn't moved. She remains the first woman ever put to death in an electric chair, anywhere in the world, and every detail the officials improvised that morning became the template for the women who followed her into that same room. Nearly 30 years would pass before another woman sat in that chair. When it finally happened, the country wasn't arguing about whether the execution was humane. It was staring at a photograph. Ruth Snyder. In January of 1928, a photographer from Chicago walked into the Sing Sing death house with a small plate camera strapped to his ankle and his trouser leg cut just enough to expose the lens. At the exact moment the current reached Ruth Snyder, he tripped the shutter. The image ran across the entire front page the next morning under a single word, and it would go on to inspire one of the most famous crime films ever made. But to understand why 500,000 New Yorkers lined up to buy that photograph, you have to go back to a quiet house in Queens. Ruth Brown was born in Manhattan in 1895, left school after the 8th grade, and worked her way into a secretarial job at a boating magazine. There, in 1915, she met and married the art editor, Albert Snyder, a reserved man 13 years her senior. They had a daughter, Lorraine, in 1918. But Albert still mourned a former fiancé who had died years before, hanging her portrait in the house and naming his boat after her, and Ruth, restless and outgoing, came to resent the marriage almost entirely. In 1925, Ruth began an affair with a married corset salesman named Henry Judd Gray. They met at the Waldorf Astoria, where her young daughter would ride the hotel elevators to pass the time, and somewhere in that arrangement, resentment turned into a plan. Ruth quietly took out life insurance on her husband, including a $45,000 policy with a double indemnity clause that would pay $96,000 if Albert died in an accident. Put plainly, if she could make his death look accidental, Ruth stood to collect a fortune that would have set her up for the rest of her life. She paid the premiums herself, and to keep Albert from ever seeing the paperwork, she arranged for the postman to signal the mail by ringing the bell twice. A detail so memorable it later lent its name to another crime novel entirely. By the time of the murder, the affair had been running for nearly 2 years, and Ruth had grown bolder with every month of it. Gray later described a whole string of earlier attempts on Albert's life that had simply failed, doses that did not take, schemes that fell apart before they began, a persistence that unsettled even the jurors who later heard about it. To much of the public, Ruth Snyder came to stand for something larger than a single crime. She became a dark symbol of the age, the modern woman turned deadly, and the newspapers leaned into that image with everything they had. They sold papers on the unsettling idea that the danger in a marriage might now come from the wife, that a smiling housewife in a quiet Queens home could be quietly counting the days until a policy paid out. It was a caricature, and it was also, in her case, close enough to the truth to frighten people. According to Gray, she tried more than once to arrange Albert's death before the night it finally came. On March 20th, 1927, after a party, the two of them set upon Albert as he slept, using a window sash weight, a length of picture wire, and a rag soaked in chloroform. By morning he was dead, and they had staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. They were not good at it. The house was supposedly ransacked, yet nothing of real value had actually been taken. The intruders Ruth described had left no trace. The knots that bound her were far too gentle to be real, and the jewelry she had reported stolen turned up under a mattress. On top of all of it sat a small pin engraved with the initials JG in plain view. When a detective casually mentioned Judd Gray's name, Ruth blurted out the question that ended the case on the spot, asking whether he had already confessed. Both of them soon did, and each began blaming the other. How does a pair this careless become a national obsession? The trial answered that within a day. It opened in Queens in the spring of 1927 before Judge Townsend Scudder, a man who personally opposed the death penalty he was now bound to impose, with Richard Newcomb leading the prosecution. It turned into a spectacle at once, with novelists and filmmakers packing the gallery, among them the writer James Cain and the film pioneer D.W. Griffith, all there to watch the couple turn on each other in real time. Inside the courtroom, the marriage's last night was picked apart in detail, each defendant painting the other as the true instigator. Gray cast himself as a weak man led into ruin by a scheming woman. Ruth insisted the entire plan had been his idea. The jury believed neither version enough to spare either of them. The columnist Damon Runyon nicknamed the whole affair the dumbbell murder because, in his estimation, it was so remarkably dumb, and the tabloids branded Ruth the Iron Widow and the Bloody Blonde while casting Gray as the Putty Man, the weak-willed figure she had supposedly molded to her purpose. Both were convicted of first-degree murder, which carried an automatic death sentence, and every appeal that followed went nowhere. Governor Al Smith denied clemency on January 10, 1928. A leading newspaper framed the decision around the politics of the moment, arguing that if women were now equal to men before the law, they had to face the same penalties for breaking it. In the weeks that remained, the case only grew larger, with crowds gathering and reporters competing for any scrap from inside the death house. Ruth turned toward religion, converting to Catholicism, and sealed a letter for her daughter to open when she was old enough to understand, while guardianship of Lorraine passed to Ruth's own mother. On January 12, 1928, executioner Robert Elliott carried out the sentence, with Gray following minutes later. Her reported final words borrowed from the crucifixion, asking God to forgive them, for they knew not what they did. She was the first woman put to death at Sing Sing since Martha Place, and in that single instant, the hidden camera captured the image that would make her permanent, printed the next morning above a one-word headline, and sold in such numbers that the paper reportedly reached a circulation record of more than 1.5 million copies. That photograph, grainy and blurred and taken from an ankle, remains the first and only known picture of a woman's electrocution, and one of the most reproduced images in the history of journalism. The case became the blueprint for the novel and film Double Indemnity, lent its texture to another Kane story about a scheming wife, and was reworked into a Broadway play by a reporter named Sophie Treadwell, who had sat through the trial. Nearly a century on, Ruth Snyder is remembered less for what she did than for the one frame that recorded her final second. The insurance policy at the center of her case would prove to be less an exception than a pattern. 7 years later, another woman would ride that same motive all the way to the same chair, this time from a roadhouse in the hills of upstate New York. Eva Koo. On a stormy night in June of 1934, a sheriff in upstate New York exhumed a man's body, loaded it into a car, and drove it back to the abandoned farmhouse where his life had ended, so that the two women accused of taking it could reenact the crime by the glare of headlights in the rain. It remains one of the strangest scenes in the history of New York justice. At the center of it stood a roadhouse madam named Eva Koo, and the man in the ground had once been her handyman. Eva Koo came to upstate New York from Ontario, Canada, and by the height of Prohibition, she was running a thriving speakeasy, roadhouse, and brothel outside Oneonta that everyone knew as Little Ava's Place. Laborers, students, and more than a few local officials passed through her doors, and she was loud, generous, and well-connected among all of them. Business was good, right up until the country repealed Prohibition and the customers stopped coming. When the money dried up, Eva Koo looked at the one asset she had left. That asset was Harry Wright, a disabled alcoholic handyman in his early 50s who had come to live and work at the inn after his mother died, trading part of his inheritance for room and board. Koo had already helped herself to much of what he owned. His late mother's house had burned down under circumstances no one could explain, after which Koo collected on the insurance and sold the land. Then she took out several life insurance policies on Wright himself, with the figures reported at the time ranging from a few $1,000s to as much as $16,000, and roughly $12,000 most often cited. She named herself the sole beneficiary and arranged for him to sign his mother's house over to her and write her into his will. By the time the plan came together, the world that had made Eva Koo rich was already gone. Prohibition had ended, the roadhouse trade had collapsed, and the woman who once counted officials among her friends was staring down real ruin. Harry Wright, quiet and dependent, and worth more dead than alive, became her way out. On June 14, 1934, Koo and a friend and employee named Martha Clift lured Wright to an abandoned, reputedly haunted farmhouse near Crumhorn Mountain, telling him they were there to dig up cherry trees. What happened next, both women eventually described, each insisting the other had done the actual harm. Koo struck Wright with a wooden mallet, and as he lay on the ground, he reportedly said he finally understood why she had brought him there. Clift then ran him over with a rented car. They left his body in a roadside ditch to stage a hit and run, and at first it worked, because the coroner ruled exactly that. For a short while the ruling held, and Harry Wright was simply another man struck down on a dark country road. What changed everything was greed pressing its luck. When Koo filed her insurance claim, the size of it, layered on top of policies almost no one had known about, drew exactly the scrutiny she could not afford. Investigators went looking, turned up the paperwork, and quietly began treating a traffic death as something else entirely. Both women were soon arrested, and both confessed while pointing at each other. That is what brought the sheriff back to the farmhouse in the rain on June 21st, staging the exhumation and the reenactment to reconstruct exactly who had done what. The recovered body propped in the headlights, while the two of them were made to show, step by step, how a man had died. And no, I'm not making that up. Koo would later claim she had been deprived of sleep for 2 full days and a night before she ever signed her confession, and her lawyers would spend the trial arguing the whole statement had been squeezed out of an exhausted, frightened woman. But would a jury care how the confession was obtained, once they had heard how Harry Wright met his end? The trial opened in Cooperstown in August of 1934 and ran nearly 3 weeks, and the whole affair took on the atmosphere of a county fair grafted onto a capital case. People came from miles to sit in on it. Vendors sold ice cream and 25-cent souvenir mallets shaped like the weapon, and the newspapers fed a public that could not look away from a woman accused of running a man down for money. The district attorney called 74 witnesses, among them Martha Clift, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against her former friend. The jury convicted Eva Koo of first-degree murder in about 2 hours. Clift received 20 years. When word reached Koo's family in Canada, her sister told reporters she simply couldn't believe it, that Eva had come from a good home with a good mother and father, and that it seemed impossible a girl with her background could do such a thing. Even the prison warden, Louis Laws, later said Koo had gotten a rotten deal all around, noting that one of her own trial lawyers had written in asking for an invitation to watch her die. Her final appeal went to Governor Herbert Lehman, who declined to step in. Harry Wright had always been an easy man to overlook, a limping, hard-drinking handyman whom the world had largely forgotten, and that was exactly what made him useful to the woman he trusted. He had signed away his mother's house, let Koo manage what money he had, and leaned on the person who ran the roadhouse where he lived. That trust became the instrument of his undoing. As the case ground through the courts, Koo's lawyers fought the confession at every stage, pressing appeal after appeal and insisting that a sleep-starved, terrified woman had been made to say whatever her questioners wanted to hear. The higher courts were unmoved by all of it. The conviction held, the date was set, and the same grim machinery that Martha Place's execution had first improvised, more than 3 decades earlier, was quietly made ready once again. For all her connections in the good years, the men who had once been glad to drink at little Eva's place were nowhere to be found now. On June 27, 1935, Eva Koo became the 5th woman put to death in Sing Sing's chair. She refused her final meal, apparently certain to the last that the governor would spare her. He did not. Escorted into the room by 2 weeping matrons, she said only 2 words, "Goodbye, darlings," as the chaplain began the 23rd Psalm. No one claimed her body. She was buried in a potter's field, and outside of a handful of local historians and true crime accounts, her name has largely faded from memory, one of the least remembered women ever to sit in that chair. Her motive was money, and her method was blunt. The woman who came next worked in the opposite direction, quietly and over years, with a poison that left almost no trace, inside a household so tangled that the truth stayed buried until an anonymous letter forced it into the open. Mary Frances Creighton. By the time Mary Frances Creighton was finally convicted of a poisoning, she had already stood trial for 2 others, and walked free both times. The press called her the Long Island Borgia, and for years it looked as though she would never answer for any of it. What finally undid her wasn't a detective or a deathbed accusation. It was a glass of eggnog and a household arrangement so tangled that the entire case turned on it. Mary Frances Creighton was born in New Jersey in 1899, orphaned young and raised by her grandparents. She married a man named John Creighton and had 2 children. And through the 1920s, an unusual number of people around her began dying of arsenic poisoning. Each death, it turned out, came attached to a life insurance policy or an inheritance that pointed back to her. In 1923, she and her husband were tried for the arsenic death of her own teenage brother, whose modest insurance policy and trust fund benefited her directly. The prosecution couldn't prove she had ever purchased the poison, and a sympathetic jury acquitted a pregnant, nursing young mother. Almost immediately, she was put on trial again, this time for the death of her mother-in-law, and acquitted a second time, helped along by a toxicologist who found only trace amounts of arsenic in the body. She was quietly suspected in the death of her father-in-law as well. Twice, juries had looked at Mary Frances Creighton and seen a young mother rather than a poisoner. In the first trial, she sat pregnant and nursing while the state failed to place the poison in her hands. In the second, the science itself came to her rescue, when the chemist found too little arsenic to prove anything at all. 2 acquittals in quick succession seemed to teach her a dangerous lesson, that she could not be touched. Dogged by suspicion at every turn, the family finally moved to Baldwin, on Long Island, hoping to start over where no one knew their name. In Baldwin, the Creightons took in another couple during the Depression, Everett Applegate, a local veterans official, and his wife Ada. Under that roof, Applegate, a grown man, betrayed the trust of the household and began an improper relationship with the Creightons' teenage daughter, misconduct that reportedly unfolded with his own wife's knowledge. He was, at the same time, involved with Mary Frances herself, who later claimed he had blackmailed her into it by threatening to expose her past. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The household in Baldwin had become something the neighbors could only guess at. 4 adults and 2 teenage girls bound together by money, dependence, and secrets that pressed on every one of them. Ada Applegate, unwell and rarely leaving her bed, sat near the center of it, entirely unaware that the friend tending to her had already decided how her story would end. Even the future of Creighton's own daughter had been folded into the arrangement, held up afterward as part of the reason it all supposedly had to happen. When Ada finally fell ill and died, the family closed ranks and the attending doctors signed off on a heart attack, and for a few quiet weeks, it looked as though the household might simply absorb one more death and carry on as before. It was an anonymous letter, not a grieving relative, that refused to let it. In September of 1935, Ada Applegate, heavy-set and largely confined to her bed, fell suddenly ill and died at home. Her passing was first written off as a heart attack, and it might have stayed that way. But an anonymous letter reminded Nassau County investigators of those old poisoning trials, and this time they ordered an autopsy. The toxicologist found a massive dose of arsenic, roughly 11 grains, where about 3 was considered lethal. Under questioning, Creighton confessed. She admitted putting the poison in Ada's eggnog and gave her reason plainly, saying she had done it so that Applegate would eventually be free to be with her daughter. She also confessed at last to the death of her brother 12 years earlier. Through every twist of it, her husband, John Creighton, stood by her, insisting on her innocence even as her own words in court said otherwise. What had begun as a shared house during hard times had curdled into a web of affairs, threats, and secrets, with a dead woman at the center of it. And the more Mary Frances explained, the worse it looked, because each explanation only confirmed how deliberate the poisoning had been. The scientific case against her rested, strangely, on the same kind of expert testimony that had once helped set her free. Years earlier, a toxicologist had found only traces of arsenic and handed her an acquittal. This time, the science ran the other way, describing a dose so enormous there could be no innocent explanation for it, far beyond anything a body might take in by accident. Set beside Creighton's own admissions from the witness stand, the chemistry left the jurors almost nothing to debate. It was a rare and bitter turn. A woman cleared once on the strength of what the laboratory could not prove, and condemned the next time by what it could. They convicted her and Everett Applegate together, and the court pronounced the sentence the verdict made inevitable. After 2 acquittals, could the state finally make a poisoning charge hold? This time it could, largely because Creighton did the work for them. The trial opened in Nassau County in January of 1936, prosecuted by District Attorney Elvin Edwards, and the newspapers that had once called her the Long Island Borgia now added the Black-Eyed Borgia to their headlines. On the stand, asked whether she had carried the poisoned glass to Ada with her own hands, she answered that she had, on Applegate's instruction. Asked whether she had stood by and watched her closest friend die, she said yes. Both she and Everett Applegate were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The weeks before the execution became their own ordeal. Creighton collapsed again and again, lost a great deal of weight, and slid into what doctors called a hysterical paralysis, until a medical commission examined her, found no physical illness, and declared her fit to die. Every appeal for the two of them failed. On the night of July 16, 1936, she was wheeled into the death house, reportedly sedated nearly into unconsciousness, and said nothing at all. Everett Applegate went to the chair the same night, protesting his innocence to the very end, swearing before God that he was innocent and asking that God have mercy on the soul of his own defense attorney. It made the case a rare one in the prison's history. A woman and her male co-defendant put to death within minutes of each other. In a final footnote, the 2 teenage girls at the center of the scandal were said to have waited out the night over hamburgers in a nearby room. Mary Frances Creighton is remembered today as one of the few defendants to beat a poisoning charge not once, but twice before a third finally held, and as half of one of the only same-night executions of a woman and her partner the prison ever carried out. Nearly 90 years later, her case is still a fixture in almost every serious account of American poisoners. Every woman so far had money or jealousy at the heart of her story, and the courts and the newspapers tended to explain each of them the same way, as someone led astray by the man beside her. The final 2 complicate that idea. One was convicted in a courtroom just as crowded as Creighton's, sent to the very same chair, and then almost entirely forgotten. The other refused to be anyone's accomplice at all. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Helen Fowler. In the autumn of 1943, a man walked into a rooming house in Niagara Falls with more than $1,000 in his pockets and never walked back out. The woman who lived there would be convicted of his death largely on the word of her own daughter, testimony that was quietly taken back years later. And when the state finally carried out her sentence, she became the only black woman New York would legally put to death in the entire 20th century. Helen Fowler was born in December of 1906 and lived in the red light district along Memorial Parkway in Niagara Falls, New York. She ran a rooming house, raised several children, and by some accounts supported the household in part through prostitution. She was, by every description, a hard woman in a hard place. And in the fall of 1943, a stranger with a pocket full of cash drifted into her orbit. The victim was George Fowler, a 63-year-old service station owner from nearby Ransomville, who happened to share her surname by pure coincidence. A coincidence so confusing that even her death certificate would later describe him, wrongly, as her husband. On the 30th of October, 1943, he went out carrying at least $1,000 in cash and checks, and boasting about it to anyone who would listen. He ended up at Helen Fowler's home. There, one of her boarders, a young man named George Knight, harmed him fatally, and the two of them hid the body in a trunk. For weeks, the disappearance was just that, a well-off man who had gone out flashing money and simply never come home. Then the river gave him back. His body was thrown from the North Grand Island Bridge into the Niagara River and surfaced on the 8th of December, and the investigation moved quickly from a missing person to a homicide with a clear trail of stolen cash and checks. That trail led straight to the rooming house on Memorial Parkway, and to the two people who had been the last to see George Fowler alive. Both Fowler and Knight were charged with first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. But how much of what happened inside that house could the state actually prove? The answer came from inside Helen's own family. The trial opened in Niagara County Court in Lockport in February of 1944, before Justice William Munson, with John Marsh prosecuting, and it carried a few distinctions of its own. It was the first murder trial the county had seen in years, and the first there ever to seat women on the jury, 5 of them on the final panel. The prosecution's star witness was Helen's own 18-year-old daughter, Genevieve Persons, who testified that she had watched Knight strike the victim while her mother knelt nearby. For a small county that rarely saw a case like this, the trial became an event, argued in a packed courtroom before jurors who had never sat in judgment of a capital charge. The evidence against Helen Fowler was almost entirely the word of others, her daughter above all, and the felony murder rule meant she did not have to strike a single blow to face death for the outcome. When the jury sent out a question during deliberations, asking whether 2 people could both be guilty of murder when only one had struck the fatal blow, Justice Munson answered that anyone engaged in the commission of a felony was equally guilty under the law. The district attorney called it the most brutal crime the city had ever seen. Even Helen's own defense attorney, Earl Bridges, a man who would one day become one of the most influential lawmakers in the state, conceded she was guilty of any number of things, but insisted first-degree murder was not one of them. The jury disagreed, returning a conviction with no recommendation for mercy. On the 19th of February, Munson sentenced both to death. What makes the case sit uneasily, even now, is what came afterward. Helen's daughter, the state's key witness, is reported to have later recanted her testimony, admitting she had cut a deal after being caught trying to cash the victim's checks, though that account rests on a single later source and was never tested in court. Helen's 2 younger children, called for the defense, had testified that their mother actually tried to stop Knight. One investigator who questioned her said she was the hardest person he had ever interrogated. In her final hours, Helen dictated a desperate plea for mercy to New York's lieutenant governor, the governor himself being unavailable to hear it. In it, she turned on another of her daughters, claiming the girl and a friend had tried to poison her to be rid of her, and repeating a cruel line the girl had supposedly said about how she would look in the chair. She insisted she was guilty of no murder and no robbery, only of helping to move the man out of the house, and she begged, again and again, for her life. Her final written words spoke of a mother's love and of the disgrace that had brought her to that place. Her appeals moved through the courts and failed one after another, and the case drew almost none of the national attention that had swirled around the women before her. There were no crowds gathered outside Sing Sing, no tabloid nicknames, no photographers scheming for a picture that would shock the country. A poor black woman from a red-light district, convicted largely on a relative's word in a county that barely knew her name, Helen Fowler was condemned in something close to silence. And it is that silence, as much as anything she is supposed to have done, that has kept her at the very margins of this story for the better part of a century. No mercy came. On the 16th of November, 1944, escorted by a chaplain, Helen Fowler was put to death at Sing Sing a little after 11 o'clock at night. George Knight followed her into the same room minutes later, pausing only to thank everyone for being kind to him. They were the 19th and 20th people executed at that prison in a single year, and 4 lives ended in that room that one night. Helen Fowler's body went unclaimed and was buried by the state, in a plot whose exact location is disputed even now. For most of the last 80 years, that was where her story ended, overshadowed at the time by a war that filled every front page. Her execution came only days after the Royal Air Force sank a famous German battleship, and there was almost no room left in the papers for a quiet death in Ossining. But in recent years, her case has been pulled back into the light, revisited in a 2024 stage production, and championed by a local village historian determined that the only black woman New York executed in the 20th century should not be forgotten. Her story, in other words, isn't finished being told. For most of these women, the courts and the newspapers reached for the same explanation: a woman led astray by the man beside her. The last of them broke that pattern completely. She wasn't anyone's accomplice, and she wasn't anyone's victim. She was an equal partner in a spree that stretched across state lines. Martha Beck. She trained as a nurse and graduated near the top of her class. A few years later, she and the man she met through a Lonely Hearts advertisement would be known across the country as the Lonely Hearts Killers, blamed for as many as 20 deaths. What turned a hospital nurse into half of the most infamous killing couple of her era came down to a single consuming emotion, and it wasn't greed. Martha Beck was born Martha Seabrook in Milton, Florida, in 1920. She matured early and struggled with her weight for most of her life, and by her own later account, she had endured abuse as a child. Still, she trained as a nurse, graduated with high marks, worked briefly as an undertaker's assistant, and then at an army hospital, and became a single mother of 2. By 1947, she was raising her children and working at a children's hospital in Pensacola. And that year, lonely and looking for something more, she answered an advertisement in a Lonely Hearts Club. The man who answered was Raymond Fernandez, and he was not what he presented himself to be. Years earlier, a heavy steel hatch had struck him in the head aboard a ship, and by many accounts the man who recovered was a different person than the one before, charming, grandiose, and dangerous. He made his living answering Lonely Hearts ads, courting isolated women and stripping them of their savings. He wore a toupee, dabbled in the occult, and was already suspected in the death of a woman in Spain who had made him her beneficiary shortly before dying without warning. Fernandez first saw Martha Beck as just another mark. Instead, the two of them fell into a bond that neither seemed able to break. Beck gave up her 2 children to be with him, then became his partner in the very scheme that had nearly ensnared her. She traveled with him, posing as his sister, while he romanced one lonely woman after another, and she was consumed by jealousy every time he took one of those courtships too far. The pattern was always the same. Fernandez would find a lonely woman through the ads, write to her, charm her, and move in, with Beck at his side playing the role of a protective sister. The money would follow, and so again and again would a death, because Beck could not stand to watch a courtship become real. What had started as a swindle turned, victim by victim, into something neither of them stopped. Between 1947 and 1949, investigators came to believe the pair were responsible for as many as 20 deaths, though that figure was always an estimate. They were firmly linked to 3 and convicted of 1. The one that sent them to the chair was Janet Fay, a 66-year-old widow from Albany. In January of 1949, after Fay handed over thousands of dollars in a Long Island apartment, Beck, by her own testimony burning up with jealousy and anger, struck her fatally with a hammer while Fernandez helped. They buried her in cement in the cellar of a rented house in Queens. Weeks later, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the pair moved in on a 41-year-old widow named Delphine Downing and her young daughter. Fernandez shot Delphine, and when the couple feared the little girl might give them away, her life was taken as well. Both were buried beneath the basement floor. It was suspicious neighbors, not detectives, who finally forced the door open, and a police visit at the end of February uncovered both at once. When the officers came, the couple did not run, and what waited in that basement ended any chance of the scheme going on. Fernandez talked and kept talking, at times seeming almost proud of it, boasting to the Michigan police that he was no ordinary killer. Beck framed everything through the same lens she would carry all the way to the chair, that whatever she had done because she could not bear to share the man she loved. So how do you defend 2 people who confessed to all of it? Their lawyer reached for the only argument left and told the court they were insane. Fernandez had confessed freely at first, at one point claiming as many as 17 deaths before taking much of it back, and later insisting he had confessed only to shield Beck. He believed that because Michigan had no death penalty, the 2 of them were safe. He was wrong. Both were extradited to New York, which very much did have a death penalty, to stand trial for the death of Janet Fay. The trial ran through the summer of 1949 in the Bronx, before Judge Ferdinand Pecora, and it became a genuine sensation, packed with lurid testimony about sex and the occult, and crowds so eager to get inside that the courtroom nearly broke into a riot. The tabloids were merciless, mocking Beck's weight at every turn. At one point, in front of the whole room, she threw her arms around Fernandez and cried out that she loved him and always would. Charging the jury, Judge Pecora told them plainly that whatever abnormalities the 2 had admitted to, that was not the same thing as the kind of insanity that excuses a crime. The jury of 10 men and 2 women agreed, convicting both of first-degree murder with no recommendation for mercy. On the 22nd of August, Pecora sentenced them to death. The appeals dragged on for more than a year and came to nothing. On the 8th of March, 1951, both were put to death at Sing Sing, in a night that saw 4 executions carried out. Fernandez had to be helped to the chair, and his final words were that he wanted to shout that he loved Martha and to ask what the public could possibly know about love. Beck ate a last meal of fried chicken and went last of all. Her prepared statement called her story a love story, one that only those tortured by love could ever understand, and said that even the death house had done nothing but deepen what she felt for Raymond. She was 30 years old. What made the pair so hard to explain, then and now, was how ordinary each had once seemed on paper. A decorated-sounding con man and a trained hospital nurse, folded into a partnership that turned lethal the instant jealousy entered the room. Neither of them ever truly blamed the other. Fernandez went to his death professing his love out loud, and Beck went to hers insisting that love was the only thing she had ever really been guilty of. Whether that was madness, devotion, or something with no clean name at all, the courts were never able to say. Martha Beck's case never really left the culture. It has been retold on film at least 3 times over the decades that followed. From the Honeymoon Killers in 1970 to a Spanish-language retelling in the 1990s to a star-led version in 2006, each one circling the same uneasy question of how much was love and how much was something far darker. Among all the women who died in Sing Sing's electric chair, she remains the only one convicted as a serial killer, and the only one who went to it insisting, to the very end, that everything she had done out of love. 6 women, 1 prison, and a chair that drew no distinction between any of them. From the first woman ever to sit in it to the last profiled here, their cases still shape how we argue about crime, punishment, and who a society chooses to remember. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.